Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're embarking on an incredible journey through one of the world's most populous and historically rich regions, South Asia. We're talking about a subcontinent home to nearly 1 billion people, just a vibrant tapestry of languages, religions, cultures. It's a place often simplified, in our understanding.
Me to simplify it.
But as we'll discover, its history is, it's a profound story of constant change, adaptation, and intense contestation.
Indeed. And to guide our deep dive today, we're drawing from a really exceptionally comprehensive source. It's called Modern South Asia, History, Culture, and Political Economy. It's by two leading historians, Sugata Bose and Ayesha Jalal.
Right.
And this isn't just a textbook, not at all. It's a powerful work of synthesis and interpretation. It's packed with new insights that directly challenge conventional wisdom. And it's written to be accessible, to anyone with intellectual curiosity. It truly reshaped my own understanding.
Okay, great. So our mission today is to cut through those common stereotypes, whether they're, optimistically fanciful or just pejoratively simplistic. We want to grasp the enormous complexities of South Asia's past 3 centuries, right up to the present day. We're going to explore how its politics, cultures, and economies have shaped the lives of over 1/5 of humanity. We'll be focusing on what the authors called the twin dialectics, like centralism versus regionalism and nationalism versus communalism, and also looking at power relations, class, gender, caste.
Oh, crucial.
Get ready for some truly fascinating insights, things that will, I think, reframe your perspective on this vital part of the world.
Definitely. So let's start by traveling way back millennia, actually, to the Indus Valley civilization around 3000 BC. Just imagine these sophisticated urban centers like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. Their urban planning, streets, drainage, it was immaculate. Frankly, it might put some of today's modern cities to shame.
It's remarkable, isn't it? An advanced literate culture so ancient, yet their script remains a complete mystery. What's the biggest question scholars are still grappling with there? And what little do we know about their beliefs or, how they interacted with the wider world?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. The undeciphered script is, it's definitely the biggest puzzle. What incredible stories are hidden in those symbols, right?
Right.
But from the archaeology, we do know they engaged in extensive long-distance trade, like with Mesopotamia. And we found these venerated symbols like the mother goddess and the bull, and echoes of these actually reappear much later in Indian civilization, suggesting really deep roots.
Wow. So from those ancient origins, how do we then get to the Vedic age, around 1500 BC?
Okay, so transitioning to around 1500 BC, we encounter the Indo-Aryans. And it's important to stress this wasn't a racial group, as people once incorrectly thought. It was a linguistic group. Their society, economy, politics, we learn about them from the Vedas, particularly the Rig Veda.
Yeah.
And we see their shift from nomadic pastoralism to settled agriculture, mainly in the fertile Gangetic Plain.
I'd never really thought of early Indo-Aryan society as democratic. What parts of the Vedas point to that kind of surprising element?
It is a surprising detail, isn't it? Our source highlights that early Indo-Aryan political organization actually had a strong democratic element. They had these popular assemblies called Sabha, open to all free men, apparently, and more select gatherings called Samiti for the elites. This predates many of the later monarchical forms of government we tend to associate with ancient empires.
Huh. And what about something as enduring as the caste system? Did its origins lie in this period too?
Yes, we also delve into the origins of the famous caste system here. It's initially mentioned in the Rig Veda as 4 varna, which are these broad social orders: Brahmins, the priests; Kshatriyas, the warriors; Vaishyas, merchants and farmers; and Shudras, the laborers. But a really crucial distinction the authors make is how jati, which are subcastes, often based on occupation, became far more relevant and more rigid in actual social practice than the broader varna.
I see.
And then later, the Upanishads provided a kind of philosophical justification for this rigidity through the doctrine of karma. Your actions in this life determine your status in the next, which effectively sort of locks people into their social positions.
That's a fascinating and kind of sobering connection.
Yeah.
So from the 6th century BC, this Brahmanical social order faced some significant challenges. What new movements came about?
Exactly. From the 6th century BC, the Brahmanical order faced widespread challenge. This led to the rise of 2 incredibly influential movements, led by Gautama Buddha and Mahavira, the founders of Buddhism and Jainism.
Right.
And interestingly, both came from the Kshatriya caste, the warrior caste. They profoundly questioned the caste system itself, and also the elaborate Vedic rituals.
Yeah.
Buddhism especially advocated a new ethical conception of human affairs through the Eightfold Path, emphasizing moral conduct and spiritual development over birth status.
Okay, so from these spiritual challenges, we then move to India's classical empires. Tell us about the Maurya and Gupta dynasties.
Right. So the Magadhan kingdom expanded dramatically under the Maurya dynasty. They formed an empire embracing almost the entire subcontinent under Chandragupta Maurya, and it reached its peak under Emperor Ashoka. He's legendary partly for this bloody war against Kalinga.
Ah, yes, a conversion story.
Exactly. It apparently led to such a profound change of heart that he converted to Buddhism if the Buddhist sources are to be believed, and he ardently championed nonviolence, trying to govern through moral persuasion rather than just force.
So from that kind of empire building, let's fast forward to what's often called India's classical era, the Gupta dynasty, around 320 AD. But our source points out something interesting. While this period saw a resurgence of Brahmanical traditions and, rigid caste hierarchies, it also, maybe surprisingly, displayed remarkable political, social, and religious flexibility. How did those seemingly contradictory forces coexist?
It is a fascinating paradox, isn't it? The Gupta era definitely saw a renewed emphasis on Brahmanical rituals and caste. But what made it classical was its incredible dynamism, its energy. We see immense economic prosperity, thriving long-distance trade, and truly breathtaking literary, scientific, and cultural achievements. Think of the brilliant playwright Kalidasa or the mathematician Aryabhata.
Zero and the decimal system, right?
Exactly. Pioneered the decimal system and the concept of zero. So this wasn't some static rigidity. It was a period of profound intellectual and creative ferment, kind of bubbling with ideas.
Okay. Now, shifting south, what developments were unfolding there from around the 8th century?
Right. Shifting south from the 8th century, we see a really dynamic contrast. Here, the Bhakti movement emerged as a powerful countercurrent. It fundamentally challenged the established Brahmanical order by emphasizing direct personal devotion to God, accessible to anyone, regardless of caste or gender.
Ah, so more inclusive.
Very much so. Its significance isn't just religious, it's a powerful example of how existing social hierarchies were constantly being reshaped, even within spiritual realms. And notably, it included revered women saints like Andal, highlighting an often overlooked aspect of female agency in that period.
That really underscores the dynamism, doesn't it? Challenging those stereotypes of a changeless tradition. What else was happening around this time?
Well, this period also saw the rise of powerful southern kingdoms like the Cholas. They extended their political, economic, and cultural influence across Southeast Asia. And importantly, the first wave of Arab political expansion reached the subcontinent in 644 AD, leading to the conquest of Sind in 712. But interestingly, these early Arab traders were apparently more interested in profit than large-scale conversions.
The real infusion of Turco-Persian influence into Indo-Islamic culture began later, with Turkish and Afghan invasions starting from the 11th century. So after that initial entry, we see the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in 1206. How did that impact the cultural landscape?
The Delhi Sultanate, established in 1206. It saw significant incursions into the Deccan region and also the rise of powerful southern kingdoms like the Hindu Vijayanagara Empire. But what's truly compelling here, according to our source, is how a genuine Indo-Muslim culture was forged in the 14th century. It was built more on Hindu-Muslim alliance building and reciprocity rather than just constant conflict, which is sometimes the perception.
That sounds like a profound fusion. Were there specific spiritual movements that played a role in this cultural blending?
Yes. Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, played a particularly influential role. Its emphasis on love, devotion, and direct experience of God resonated quite strongly with existing Indian spiritual traditions. This helped facilitate Islam's accommodation within its Indian environment. It was instrumental in many conversions, and notably, women mystics also contributed significantly to this rich tradition.
This cultural fusion, you could argue, culminated in the Mughal Empire, founded in 1526 by Zahiruddin Babur. What truly stands out about this remarkable achievement?
The Mughals were, a truly remarkable achievement, but what really stands out, as our source emphasizes, is how Emperor Akbar, he was keenly aware that most of his subjects were non-Muslims, so he actively built alliances with Hindus. He even appointed them to high military and administrative ranks.
He sounds like quite the visionary. What else did he do to foster this kind of interfaith harmony.
He really was for his time. Akbar even abolished the jizya, which is a tax specifically on non-believers. That was a bold move.
Definitely.
He experimented with his own syncretic faith, the Diniyahi, and he fostered lively interreligious debates in the Ibadat-khana, the house of worship. His successors largely continued this flexibility, though there were some later reversals under Emperor Aurangzeb. And of course, the empire presided over immense cultural and architectural achievements, the Taj Mahal, the Red Fort,
Iconic.
and the rich evolution of North Indian classical music, a really vibrant period.
Okay, so Aurangzeb's death in 1707 is often seen as this major turning point, maybe the beginning of the end for Mughal power. What factors did the authors pinpoint as most significant in its weakening?
The book highlights a confluence of factors, really. Crippling military costs were a big one, widespread agrarian revolts by groups like the Marathas and Sikhs, and a growing assertion of autonomy by provincial governors. All these things steadily eroded the empire's central authority.
And was this a straightforward decline, or was it something more complex?
That's precisely the debate historians have. Was it a decline or more of a decentralization? Our source kind of leans into the latter idea, pointing out that many revolts actually happened in relatively prosperous regions, and they were often led by wealthy local figures. This challenges that simple narrative of just exploitation leading to poverty and then resistance. It suggests a more complex, dynamic shifting of power.
Beyond these internal pressures, were there external factors at play as well?
Absolutely. External pressures played a role too. There were tribal incursions, disruptions to European bullion flows, which affected the economy. And we see figures like Nadir Shah, the Persian ruler, who devastatingly sacked Delhi in 1739. He famously took the peacock throne back with him.
Right. So by the 1740s, what did India's political map actually look like? It sounds pretty fragmented.
Very fragmented. By the 1740s, provincial governors like the Nawabs of Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad, they essentially became independent kings in all but name, often relying heavily on powerful merchant bankers for finance. And at the same time, you had powerful indigenous states built by groups like the Marathas and Sikhs rising, adding to this very decentralized landscape.
What's really fascinating, though, is that even with the Mughal grandeur fading, India in the 18th century seemed to retain its cultural vitality. Popular devotional cults, innovations in Hinduism and Islam, new schools of painting. It sounds like a period often marked more by amity than animosity, maybe.
It was a remarkably vibrant period culturally, despite the political fragmentation.
Yes.
And it was this dynamic, decentralized landscape that unfortunately was ripe for European opportunism.
Enter the East India Company.
Exactly. The British East India Company began its shift from just trade to outright political dominion. This culminated in key victories like the Battle of Plassey in 1757, giving them effective control of Bengal. And then the Battle of Buxar in 1764, which forced the Mughal emperor himself to concede the Diwani the right to collect land revenues. This was a huge game changer.
So how did the company manage to dismantle what sounds like a sophisticated 18th century state system?
Yeah.
What were their main strategies?
Well, they used mechanisms like subsidiary alliances. These essentially forced Indian rulers to accept British troops and pay for them, thereby losing their sovereignty bit by bit.
Clever in a way.
And they worked hand in glove with Indian merchants and bankers, leveraging European military technology and discipline to gradually dismantle the existing Indian state system.
Was there significant resistance to this growing British encroachment?
Oh, fierce resistance, absolutely. A prime example came from Mysore in the south. Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan built a powerful, modernizing state that seriously challenged the company's intrusions. Tipu famously declared he'd rather live for 2 days like a tiger than 200 years like a sheep.
Wow.
And he chose to die fighting like a lion, as they say, rather than submitting in his ultimate defeat in 1799, a real symbol of resistance.
Okay, so after 1757, the East India Company established this elaborate state apparatus. It shifted its focus from trade to land revenues. Tell us about this controversial permanent settlement of 1793 in Bengal. What were its unforeseen consequences?
Right, the permanent settlement of 1793. It was a landmark decision, really. It gave private property rights to zamindars, who were essentially revenue collectors, in exchange for a fixed perpetual land tax payable to the company. The unforeseen consequences were immense. It often dispossessed the actual cultivators of the land. It created a new class of absentee landlords. And because the company needed that fixed income, it led to massive potent distress and indebtedness, especially when crops failed. They still had to pay.
And how did this new economic model impact India's traditional industries, like textiles?
Well, the period from 1757 to the 1810s saw what our source bluntly calls a straightforward plunder of India's revenues. This money was essentially invested in purchasing Indian manufactured goods textiles, especially for sale abroad. So Indian money buying Indian goods for British profit. But then, from the turn of the century, British industrial capitalists pushed hard for free trade. The 1813 Charter Act ended the company's trade monopoly. This led to a flood of cheap, machine-made British textiles into India.
Devastating for local artisans, I imagine.
Absolutely devastating. It severely impacted India's artisanal economy, fundamentally altering its economic landscape from a producer to more of a market for British goods.
So the author suggests this wasn't just an economic shift, but a kind of moral crisis. What did they mean by that?
Precisely. They argue that earlier despotisms in India, however absolute they might have seemed, were tempered by a political culture. This culture insisted that rulers offer some services or protection in return for high revenue. There was a sense of obligation, however limited.
Okay.
The British, however, largely ignored this historical restraint. They focused on extracting revenue without a corresponding sense of responsibility or service provision, leading to a breakdown of those traditional social contracts.
Right. Now, the 19th century also saw debates about change versus continuity under colonial rule. But here's a truly transformative insight from our source. The very rigid Indian caste system, as we often perceive it today, wasn't always so rigid. The authors argue it was largely a 19th century colonial invention, a shocking form of social engineering. How did that colonial invention actually manifest?
It is a staggering claim, isn't it? It really challenges a long-held perception. The British, basically for administrative ease and control, started to codify and institutionalize caste in ways it hadn't been before. They conducted censuses, they categorized jati into these neat, rigid hierarchies. They used caste as a basis for legal distinctions, even for military recruitment.
So they made it more formal, more fixed.
Exactly. This process, our source argues, actually hardened the system into the rigid structure we often associate with it today. It wasn't just reflecting an ancient, unchanging reality. They actively shaped it.
That's a powerful and, frankly, disturbing thought. The British also sought to sedentarize nomadic groups, didn't they? Leading to some negative stereotypes.
Yes. They aimed to settle nomadic groups, turn them into agricultural producers for revenue purposes, which, perhaps ironically or perhaps intentionally, led to the creation of deeply problematic stereotypes like the thugs of central India. This story has been largely debunked by modern historians as a kind of colonial bogeyman used for control, yet it persists, even in Hollywood films sometimes.
How did Indians respond to these pervasive Western influences in colonial policies?
Well, we see a whole range of responses. Figures like Ramamohan Roy, for instance, advocated for Western education, but he also led a nuanced campaign against sati, the practice of widow self-immolation.
Right.
At the same time, you had Muslim reformist movements emerging. They sought an internal regeneration of Islam, often with a quite ambivalent attitude towards colonial rule, sometimes collaborating, sometimes resisting.
And throughout this period, resistance wasn't just intellectual, right? It was widespread.
Oh, absolutely. Resistance was constant and varied. You had zamindari revolts, peasant revolts driven by land and revenue grievances. You had tribal uprisings like the Santhal Hul, which means a sustained uprising of 1855-56 against foreigners, and urban artisanal protests too. All of these demonstrate deep and widespread unrest caused by colonial policies. It was far from passive acceptance.
And this brings us to 1857, a truly pivotal year. Our source describes it as a serious military mutiny, yes, but also large-scale civilian uprisings that really threatened to end British rule. Now, it's fiercely debated, was it a forward-looking freedom movement, a backward-looking restorationist struggle, feudal reaction, peasant rebellion, secular, religious? What does our source conclude about this incredibly complex event?
That nuanced view that it was a bit of all of these is really compelling. The author suggests its complexity is its most important lesson. It wasn't just one thing. It was a confluence of grievances. Military discipline issues, yes, but also land discontent, anger over taxation, religious anxieties, and a desire among some elites to restore an earlier political order. Its impact was felt across so many different segments of society, which is precisely why it was so threatening to the British.
Where were the key centers of revolt and who was participating?
Key centers included Meerut, where the initial mutiny began, and especially Awadh, where it transformed into a widespread popular uprising. Here, Talukdars, these powerful landowners alongside peasants and artisans, all joined the uprising. There was also a strong legitimist reaction among some aggrieved Indian rulers and aristocrats. They sought to revive an 18th century-style state system under the figurehead of the Mughal emperor, even though the emperor himself seemed quite aware of his diminished position, captured in his poignant poetry.
Like that line, "I am no more than a mere speck of dust." Very telling.
Very telling indeed. And the role of religion was significant too. You had Muslim millenarian preachers foretelling the end of company rule, calls for jihad or holy struggle, yet crucially there was also a conscious effort to build Hindu-Muslim unity against the Faranges, the foreigners.
And the agrarian revolts, they were a major part of it.
Huge part. The agrarian revolts were multi-class. They weren't just driven by anger against moneylenders, but by what the authors identify as the chief villain, the arbitrary and high British tax collector. So this revolt, with its diverse leadership and motivations, was much, much more than just a simple feudal reaction. It was a complex, multifaceted protest against colonial imposition.
Okay, so in the aftermath of 1857, the British Crown takes direct control. India becomes this critical colonial position strategically and economically. How did this new phase of colonialism impact India's economy further?
Well, this is when we really see the articulation of the famous drain of wealth theory. Early Indian nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji meticulously documented it. They showed how India's wealth that could have fueled its own development was systematically transferred to Britain through things like salaries paid to British officials in India and Britain, profits sent home, payments for British imports, military expenses, the list goes on.
So essentially, British policies solidified that classical colonial pattern. India as an importer of manufactured goods, exporter of raw materials. And this led to fierce debates about deindustrialization, India's disadvantaged economic status. What was the British attitude as the 19th century drew to a close?
By the late 19th century, British officials like Lord Curzon, the viceroy, exhibited a fully developed sense of racial superiority and imperial arrogance, a real sort of high noon of colonialism. This arrogance, coupled with widespread famine and pestilence, which the colonial state often failed to adequately address, fueled a growing and much more radical critique of colonial rule from within India itself.
And this radical critique, I imagine, spurred the emergence of organized Indian nationalism.
Precisely. We see the rise of early political associations, which eventually led to the founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885. Now, the early leaders used moderate constitutional methods, petitions, resolutions, but a new generation soon arose, the so-called extremists. They criticized the older leaders for their mendicancy, their begging bowl approach, arguing that polite petitions would achieve very little against such an entrenched power.
Right. And a pivotal moment in this growing nationalist assertiveness was Curzon's 1905 partition of Bengal, intended for administrative efficiency, but it clearly backfired spectacularly.
It really did. It was seen as a direct affront to Bengali identity, an attempt to divide and rule. It triggered the Swadeshi movement, a powerful wave of resistance that saw a bold redefinition of nationalist aims. Swadeshi means of one's own country. It encouraged the boycott of British goods, British institutions, and promoted Indian-made products and self-reliance. A major mobilization.
What were the different strands within that Swadeshi movement? It wasn't monolithic, was it?
Not at all. There were different strands indeed. You had moderates still pushing for incremental reform within the system. Then you had assertive leaders advocating passive resistance, mass boycotts, and even groups advocating revolutionary terror against British officials. The cry of Bande Mataram, hail to the motherland, became this incredibly powerful nationalist slogan, celebrating the motherland as a kind of sacred entity.
This era also saw a profound cultural awakening, didn't it? And debates about nationhood, modernity itself. Was nationalist thought just borrowed from the West?
That's a great question. While some nationalist thought certainly drew on Western ideas of liberalism and nationalism, it wasn't purely derivative. Figures like the poet Rabindranath Tagore or the thinker Bipin Chandra Pal articulated a vision of Indian nationalism that aspired to be both different and universal. They rejected simply copying European models of the nation-state, emphasizing India's unique spiritual and cultural contributions. It was a really powerful intellectual development alongside the political struggle.
Okay, let's move into the 20th century now. World War I. India contributed massively to the British war effort troops, resources. Nearly 60,000 Indian soldiers were killed. Our source shares this chilling quote from a soldier's letter home. "The black pepper meaning Indian troops has all been used up. It's just a stark reminder of the human cost and maybe how Indian troops were viewed as expendable."
A very stark reminder. The war indeed led to significant economic dislocations back in India too. Post-war slumps, rupee fluctuations. By 1922, London was actually forced to concede fiscal autonomy to the colonial government in India, a clear sign of Britain's weakening industrial dominance and its increasing reliance on the colony.
Then the global Great Depression hits in the 1930s. How did that reshape the relationship between Britain and India?
It had a fundamental impact. It accelerated import substitution in India, people buying Indian goods because they couldn't afford imports. British cloth imports fell dramatically. But more profoundly, the Depression wiped out India's export surplus. This led to a massive outflow of gold from the Indian countryside.
Why gold?
Distress sales. Peasants selling family gold just to survive, to pay taxes. It was another huge transfer of wealth to Britain, even though some of that gold eventually flowed to the U.S. This rupture in credit relations, as the authors call it, severely impacted India's rural poor. It made a desperate situation even worse.
It was into this incredibly decisive and difficult decade that Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi emerges on the all-India political stage, introducing his strategy of nonviolent non-cooperation, satyagraha. What provided the immediate opportunity for his first major all-India agitation?
Events like the repressive Rowlatt Acts in 1919, which allowed detention without trial, and then the horrific Jallianwala Bagh massacre in Amritsar that same year. British troops under General Dyer opened fire on a peaceful, unarmed gathering, killing hundreds. These events just galvanized public opinion against colonial rule like never before.
And how successful was Gandhi initially in uniting different communities in this struggle?
His early movements saw a really courageous display of unity among Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, particularly through the Khilafat movement. This was a pan-Islamic campaign supporting the Ottoman Caliphate, which resonated deeply with Indian Muslims and brought them into the broader independence struggle alongside Congress.
Right.
Gandhi famously called for Swaraj, self-rule, within a year. This aroused almost millenarian hopes among people. And his specific economic demands, like abolishing the salt tax, which hit the poor hardest, really mobilized the masses. The Salt March of 1930 was just electric.
The civil disobedience movement, though, while successful in mobilizing discontent, also saw increasing radicalism, didn't it? Revolutionary violence. Figures like Bhagat Singh became folk heroes.
They certainly did, representing a different, more militant strand of nationalism. The colonial state responded to all this escalating pressure with a mix of repression, arrests, crackdowns, and political concessions. This led to the Government of India Act of 1935. It granted significant provincial autonomy, elected Indian governments in the provinces. But, as our source highlights, it had a hammer blow effect, particularly on Muslims in provinces where they were a minority. Seeing Congress ministries in power, they worried about their representation and rights. This pushed the Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah to seek an alternative political strategy.
Right. The 1937 election saw a big Congress victory. But then, the Muslim League, under Jinnah, made this remarkable recovery in the 1945-46 elections, seemingly gaining a mandate for Pakistan. Yet, our source stresses that at the time, no one had a really clear idea of what Pakistan even meant, let alone its precise boundaries.
It's a crucial point, often overlooked. The demand was there, but the specifics were incredibly vague. Then World War II erupts, intensifying all these pressures. India's resources were marshaled yet again for Britain's war effort. This led to galloping inflation, severe shortages, and we have to talk about the devastating Bengal famine of 1943-44.
Yes, the numbers are just staggering.
3.5 to 3.8 million people died. And the authors stress this wasn't primarily from an absolute lack of food grains. It was from what Amartya Sen later termed a drastic decline in exchange entitlements. People simply couldn't afford food due to wartime inflation and hoarding. And critically, the state's deliberate absence of relief measures in the early stages. A truly horrific, man-made tragedy.
Politically, during the war, the Cripps mission in 1942 failed to meet Congress demands for immediate transfer of power, leading Gandhi to famously dismiss it as a post-dated check on a crashing bank.
Right. That failure paved the way for the Quit India movement of 1942. This was the biggest civilian uprising since 1857. Mass arrests, widespread disruption. And we should also highlight Subhas Chandra Bose and his Indian National Army, the INA.
Who allied with the Axis powers.
Yes, fighting alongside the Japanese. They offered a direct military challenge to British imperial power. And the INA was remarkable for uniting diverse religious and linguistic communities, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs. It even included a significant women's regiment named after the legendary Rani of Jhansi, a potent symbol.
So the war ends. Britain is weakened. Indian nationalism is peaking. The stage is set for independence, but also for partition in 1947. Now, our source offers a truly provocative interpretation here. It argues that Congress agreed to the outline of partition on the condition that it would be a final settlement, with Muslim-majority areas opting out from an already existing union of India. How did this interpretation, as they put it, destroy the entire basis of the two-nation theory as propagated by Jinnah?
This is a really central argument of the book. If Congress saw it as areas leaving a pre-existing India rather than creating two entirely separate successor states from scratch, then the creation of Pakistan, in their view, was far from being the logical culmination of the theory that there were two nations in India, was in fact its most decisive political abortion.
Well,
they suggest exclusion, not separatism, might better explain the outcome of 1947. The idea wasn't two equal nations from the start, but one nation from which certain areas would be excluded or allowed to leave. It reframes the whole event.
regardless of the political theory, the human cost was just immense. We have to acknowledge the trauma of partition.
Absolutely essential.
Hundreds of thousands perished in the violence. Millions became refugees overnight. And women and children bore the absolute full brunt of the brutality on all sides.
It's a wound that continues to reverberate across the subcontinent today. We conclude this segment thinking about Ahmed Faiz's poignant poem, Freedom's Dawn, August 1947. It captures that mood of disillusionment so powerfully, the sense that the long-looked-for break of day was not that clear dawn they had hoped for. It really encapsulates the bittersweet, tragic reality of that moment.
So, after independence in 1947, India embarked on this path of parliamentary democracy. But our source highlights a key paradox. How did the Congress Party, while dominant politically, end up relying heavily on the institutional legacies of colonialism, leading to what the authors call bureaucratic authoritarianism embedded within the state?
It's a crucial contradiction, isn't it? Congress fought for independence, but once in power, they inherited and often relied upon the colonial state's existing administrative machinery. The powerful civil bureaucracy, the military structures, the police forces.
The steel frame.
Exactly, the steel frame. This meant that even within a democratic framework, significant power remained concentrated in these unelected, often top-down institutions. This fostered a kind of bureaucratic authoritarianism, as they call it, which sometimes limited genuine democratic participation and responsiveness, especially at the grassroots level.
What about Jawaharlal Nehru's approach to development planning? He was the architect of modern India in many ways.
Nehru certainly focused on centralizing state authority for development planning. He succeeded in building a heavy industrial base, steel plants, dams, big infrastructure projects. Right. However, the authors argue this came at a cost. There was relatively little progress, they say, in combating basic poverty, illiteracy, and disease for the masses. They term it an obsession with means enhancement, building the big stuff while neglecting basic means use, ensuring people had access to essential social services like health and education.
Okay. Let's then look at Indira Gandhi's era, the populism of the early 1970s. How did her efforts to broaden Congress's social base ultimately affect the party itself?
Well, Indira Gandhi certainly expanded Congress's social base, using populist slogans like Garibi Hatao, remove poverty, which resonated widely. But in doing so, she increasingly centralized power within her own hands. Internal party democracy was eroded. The party became, in many ways, an extension of her personality rather than a vibrant, deliberative, democratic organization. This led to a personalization of power.
Then the 1980s saw a shift, the deployment of a majoritarian card.
Yes, the 1980s saw Indira Gandhi and later Rajiv Gandhi sometimes deploying what the authors call a majoritarian card against rising regional forces. This often involved appealing implicitly or explicitly to the majority Hindu population, sometimes at the expense of minority groups or regional identities. We also saw the rise of the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, during this period, effectively using religious symbols and mobilization to gain electoral support. And this era also led to tragic conflicts, like the rise of Sikh militancy in Punjab and the subsequent storming of the Golden Temple. Very turbulent times.
Finally, for India in this period, we touch on the economic reforms of the 1990s. Liberalization.
Right. The 1991 reforms aimed to liberalize the economy, moving away from the state-controlled model. This certainly spurred economic growth in many sectors. But the authors again highlight that this often came with a neglect of critical social sectors like public health and primary education, underscoring that ongoing challenge of expanding social opportunities, ensuring that economic growth actually translates into improved well-being and life chances for all citizens, not just a few.
Okay, now moving to Pakistan's post-colonial experience. It presents a very different trajectory from India's, doesn't it? Marked by political fragility and the recurring dominance of the military and bureaucracy.
A very different path, yes. In Pakistan, the political process was often, as the authors put it, curbed and distorted to ensure central authority remained strong. Political parties were often weak or undermined, and the military frequently stepped in, leading to long periods of military rule, disrupting civilian governance.
And a key example of this is General Zia-ul-Haq's military rule starting in 1977.
Yes, under Zia's long rule, he actively used religious parties and symbols to legitimize his regime and establish what he called an Islamic social order. This involved introducing deeply discriminatory ordinances, particularly affecting women's rights and the rights of religious minorities, though these were bravely resisted by groups like the Women Action Forum.
And what was the impact on regional identities within Pakistan?
Well, under Zia, we also saw Sindh province become a major venue for provincial dissidents against the central government's policies and perceived Punjabi dominance. This led to severe ethnic and linguistic conflicts in urban centers like Karachi, highlighting the deep regional and ethnic fault lines within the country.
And ultimately, Pakistan's inability to accommodate the demands of its eastern wing led to.
Yes, the inability or unwillingness to reconcile the demands of its eastern wing, East Pakistan, primarily Bengalis who felt politically marginalized and economically exploited, led directly to the brutal military crackdown by the West Pakistani Army in March 1971. This sparked a bloody civil war and ultimately the tragic dismemberment of the country, as the authors term it, leading to the formation of the independent nation of Bangladesh.
And Bangladesh, born from this violent conflict, had its own brief period of populism under Sheikh Mujibur Rahman.
Yes, its founding leader. He implemented land reforms, nationalized industries, but the country was ravaged by the war. Internal divisions and instability quickly emerged, leading to his assassination in a military coup in 1975, setting the stage for further periods of military rule there as well.
So, looking across India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh up to the late 90s, despite their very different political paths, our source points to a common set of enduring social and economic problems.
It does, and it's quite sobering.
What does this all mean for the people of these nations, decades after independence?
It means that, as of the time the book was written, nearly half the population across the region remained illiterate. Life expectancy lagged behind many neighboring East Asian countries, and a dismal women-to-men ratio, particularly in some areas, pointed to acute and persistent gender discrimination. Despite regional variations, the persistence of these issues decades after independence really underscores a key argument of the book. That when the managers of post-colonial states remain trapped in colonial modes of thinking and governance prioritizing state security over human security, for example, valuable resources get squandered on things like interstate hostilities, military buildups, while the promise of real social and economic freedom remains a mirage for the majority of the population.
Wow, what an absolutely incredible and often challenging journey through the multifaceted history of South Asia. It's just so clear that understanding this region means looking far beyond simplistic narratives. You have to appreciate the deep layers of change, continuity, and contestation that have shaped its people and its states.
Indeed. The complexities we've uncovered today, the constant interplay of local and global forces, the enduring and sometimes problematic legacies of colonialism. They offer really crucial lessons, not just about South Asia, but more broadly. It makes me think of something Rabindranath Tagore wisely suggested. He said, "Where there is genuine difference, it is only by expressing and restraining that difference in its proper place that it is possible to fashion unity." He argued, unity cannot be achieved by issuing legal fiats that everybody is one. You have to acknowledge and work with difference, not erase it.
That's a really powerful thought, isn't it? Especially relevant in today's world, everywhere. This deep dive truly shows that the past is never really past. Its echoes continue to resonate so strongly in the present. So as you, our listeners, reflect on this rich and complex history, maybe consider this. What historical forces, often unseen, might be shaping the most pressing issues in your world today? And thinking about Tagore's point, what might it take to truly unify diverse populations in the face of complex challenges without simply trying to erase their unique identities?
Definitely something to ponder. This deep dive has hopefully provided you with some essential nuggets of knowledge, some context to help inform those very questions.
Absolutely. Thank you for guiding us through that. And thank you all for joining us. Join us next time for another deep dive into the sources that help us better understand our world.